The sunrise spilled across the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of gold and pink. It was my third week commuting to the city, and already I was fed up with the endless crawl of bumper-to-bumper traffic. So, when I remembered my neighbor mentioning an old back road that cut through the outskirts of town, I decided to give it a shot. It was supposed to save me time. Soon as I turned onto the narrow road, I started to regret it. The houses disappeared, replaced by thick trees crowding either side of the cracked asphalt. The morning light barely penetrated the canopy, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. My GPS chirped at me to turn right in 200 feet. I squinted at the road ahead, but didn't see anything resembling an intersection. The screen glitched, the arrow spinning wildly for a second before the map reoriented itself. I frowned. My neighbors had warned me about this. "You don't want to take those back roads," they'd said. "Signal drops out, and it's easy to get turned around. People say it's weird back there." Weird how? They hadn't elaborated, but the memory nagged at me as I drove. I adjusted the volume on my music, trying to shake the unease building in my chest. Then I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the road, waving one arm, while the other clutched a sleek leather briefcase. He was dressed sharply, wearing a tailored suit that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the woods. I slowed the car, baiting. The guy looked normal enough, late 30s, clean cut, no sign of anything threatening. As I pulled closer, I saw his car parked a few feet ahead, its hood crumpled inward. A deer lay sprawled in front of it, twisted unnaturally, its glassy eyes fixed on the sky. I rolled down my window. "Hey, everything okay?" The man gave me a sheepish smile. "Not really. I hit that deer, and now my car's completely dead. I'm late for a meeting and my phone's out of signal. Any chance you could give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" I hesitated. He seemed polite, even apologetic, but something about the scene felt off. Maybe it was the way the air smelled, heavy and metallic, like rain on asphalt, even though the road was bone dry. "It's not far," he added quickly, sensing my doubt. "Just a couple of miles." I nodded, unlocking the door. "Yeah, sure, hop in." The man slid into the passenger seat, setting the briefcase carefully on his lap. "Thanks, I really appreciate it," he said. "Didn't want to leave my car out here." "No problem," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "This road is kind of in the middle of nowhere." He let out a dry chuckle. "Tell me about it. Thought I'd save time, but that backfired." I nodded, but said nothing. The GPS cut out completely, leaving me with no sense of where I was. And he spoke again, his voice quieter. "Fate's funny, isn't it?" I glanced at him, something about his tone sending a ripple of unease down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes you think you're making a choice, but you were always going to end up in the same place." I gripped the wheel tighter, I guess. He smiled slightly but didn't say anything else. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. The truth unfolds. I dropped him off at the gas station just as he'd asked. It was a run-down little place, the kind you'd expect to find out here. The single pump and a flickering neon sign. "Thanks again," he said, stepping out of the car. He gave me a small wave as I pulled away, disappearing into the station without a backward glance. I didn't think much of it until that evening, when I was recounting the story to my neighbor over the fence. "Yeah, he seemed nice enough," I said, describing the man in the wrecked car. "It's weird, though. He said he was late for a meeting. But who drives through those back roads in a suit?" My neighbor's face drained of color. "What did you say he looked like?" I repeated the description, my stomach sinking as her expression grew more horrified. "That's not possible," she said, her voice trembling. "That man, he died about a year ago. He hit a deer on the bridge, lost control, and went into the river. They didn't find his body until days later." I stared at her, the memory of his strange smile flashing through my mind. No. It couldn't have been the same guy. He was real. She shook her head, backing away. "You shouldn't have taken that road." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, hearing his voice in the stillness of my room. His question replayed over and over in my head. "Do you believe in fate?" It wasn't just his face I saw. It was the deer, twisted and lifeless in front of his crumpled car. The metallic smell still lingered in my nostrils, even though I'd scrubbed the floor mat in the passenger seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just outside the edge of the lamplight in my bedroom. I finally drifted off sometime before dawn, only to wake with a jolt to the sound of my alarm. The morning felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes you second-guess every sound, every movement. When it came time to leave for work, I didn't even glance toward the back road. The shortcut had lost its appeal entirely. Instead, I merged onto the main highway, slipping into the endless crawl of traffic. The familiar sea of brake lights was comforting in a way I'd never appreciated before. Cars honked, impatient drivers darted from lane to lane. It was chaotic, but it was alive. I told myself the back road had just been a bad idea, that my imagination had run wild because of the isolation. But as I inched forward, staring at the bumper in front of me, I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a moment, I swore I saw him. Sitting in the back seat, his face half lit by the gray morning light, watching me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the seat was empty. Still, I didn't look in the mirror again for the rest of the drive. I don't remember when I started driving that night, but I know how it felt. The endless stretch of asphalt, lined by towering pine trees, seemed to pull me deeper into the dark. The dashboard glow was the only light for miles, and the low hum of the engine had become background noise, blending with the occasional whistle of the wind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A routine drive home from my cousin's place, something I'd done a dozen times before. But tonight, something was different. The road, familiar in daylight, felt foreign under the cover of night. Shadows seemed thicker. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. I almost didn't see him. A figure at the edge of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights. He stood there, hand raised in a gesture so casual it almost felt like he belonged there. Almost. I should have kept driving. Instead, my foot hovered over the brake. Something about the way he stood, too still, like he was listening, made my stomach knot. But then, he shifted slightly, shoulders slumping, as if he were exhausted. Lost. The car coasted to a stop a few feet ahead of him. I didn't turn around, just watched him in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved. I rolled down the window, just a crack. Need a ride? His face was shadowed. Caught the glint of his eyes as he nodded. Yeah. His voice was soft, almost careful. If it's not too much trouble. Trouble. The word lingered in my mind as I unlocked the doors. He slid into the passenger seat without hesitation. The air in the car felt heavier as soon as the door shut. Up close, he seemed younger than I'd expected. Early 30s, maybe. His clothes were plain, oddly stiff, like they'd been folded too long and forgotten. Thanks, he murmured, settling in. I eased back onto the road, gripped tight on the wheel. Where you headed? A pause, just long enough to make me glance at him. North, he finally said. Anywhere's fine. North. Vague. I didn't press. The silence between us stretched, thick and uneasy. I flicked on the radio to fill the space. Static, and a crackling country song. It sounded warm, like it was playing from a long way off. You from around here? I asked. His head tilted slightly, like he was considering the question. Used to be. Something about the way he said it made my pulse tick faster. Used to be was a strange way to put it. I risked another glance. He was watching the trees whip past the window, eyes dark, unreadable. He hadn't asked me anything, not where I was going, not why I stopped. Most hitchhikers made small talk. He just sat there. I cleared my throat. Long trip? This time he turned his head toward me, slow and deliberate. You could say that. A beat of silence. Then his lips curled, just slightly. Not a smile. Something else. The road ahead bent slightly, curving into more darkness. I knew this route. I'd driven it before, but something about it felt wrong now. The same trees, the same turns, repeating. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. I frowned. It had been 10:17 for a while now, hadn't it? Road feels longer at night, doesn't it? He said suddenly. I startled. Had he been watching me? I forced a breath. Yeah. He nodded, like he already knew what I was going to say. Something flickered at the edge of the headlights. A shape on the side of the road. Small. Crumpled. A shoe. My foot eased off the gas. Don't stop. His voice was sharp this time. No softness, no hesitation. I swallowed, glancing at him. What was that? It doesn't matter, he said, still watching the road. Just keep driving. My fingers curled tighter around the wheel. It was in the same spot we'd passed earlier. Or had it been earlier? I shook my head, trying to push the fog from my thoughts. Just exhaustion. I'd been driving too long. That was all. Out of the corner of my eye, the hitchhiker shifted slightly, his hands curling into fists on his lap. You shouldn't have stopped for me. My stomach clenched. What? He turned his head, finally meeting my gaze. For the first time, I saw his face clearly, and I wished I hadn't. His skin wasn't just pale, it was wrong, waxy and stretched too thin, as if something beneath was wearing it. His eyes, once dark, weren't eyes at all anymore. They were empty, cavernous, endless. A noise filled the car, a low, distorted hum that wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from him. The headlights flickered. The engine coughed. The road twisted. No, it shifted, like something had grabbed the asphalt and bent it sideways. My hands tightened on the wheel. car wasn't under my control anymore. I tried to scream. The world tilted, and then... morning. I woke with a sharp, gasping breath. The airbag had deployed, pressing against my chest. Sunlight poured through the windshield, turning the interior golden. My head throbbed. I was in a ditch. The car's nose buried in an embankment, surrounded by weeds and dirt. The passenger seat was empty. I sucked in a shaky breath, then reached for my phone. The screen was cracked but still working. I called 911, voice hoarse as I explained what had happened. The words felt strange in my mouth. When the paramedics arrived, they found me still sitting in the car, dazed but alive. "You're lucky," one of them said as they loaded me into the ambulance. "Could have been a lot worse." I nodded, though my mind was still trapped in the night before. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed I had nothing more than minor injuries: a sprained wrist, mild concussion, the usual exhaustion-induced accident. "You probably nodded off at the wheel," he said. I forced a small laugh. "Yeah." I almost believed it. They discharged me that afternoon. As I stepped outside into the daylight, the world felt too bright, too sharp. Everything was normal. Too normal. I climbed into the tow truck that had come to collect my car. The driver was an older guy, talkative. I barely listened, still turning the night over in my mind, until something he said snapped me back. "Hell of a spot you crashed," he was saying. "Not the first time someone's gone off the road there. Years back, a guy died not too far from that turn." He shook his head. "Hitchhiker. Poor bastard got picked up but never made it home." I felt my breath catch. "A hitchhiker?" "Yeah. They found his body a few miles up," he said, tapping the wheel. "Weird part is, folks say he's still out there, waiting." The words settled in my chest, heavy and unmoving. Turned, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. Somewhere, in the distance, the road curved out of sight. I never looked at the passenger seat again. It wasn't the first time I'd hitched a ride, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Honestly, I didn't see what the big deal was. People love to warn me about all the weirdos out there, but in my experience, drivers were usually just bored or looking to help someone out. Besides, I didn't have the cash for a bus ticket, let alone a car of my own. So there I was, sticking my thumb out on the shoulder of Route 82. Squinting into the late afternoon sun. It didn't take long for a car to pull over. A gray sedan, a little banged up, but nothing out of the ordinary. The driver leaned over to roll down the passenger side window. He was older than me, maybe mid-40s, with a short beard and glasses that caught the glare of the sun. His smile was thin but not unfriendly. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "South side," I said, gesturing vaguely. "Past the city." He nodded, like he'd been expecting that answer. "Hop in." I didn't think twice. The seats were cracked vinyl, the kind that stuck to your skin if you sat too long, and the air inside smelled faintly of pine and something metallic. I tossed my backpack onto the floor and buckled up. "Name's Tony," he said as he pulled back onto the road. "You?" "Ryan," I replied, leaning back and propping one foot against the dash. He didn't say anything about it, so I figured he didn't care. For a while it was normal. Small talk about the weather, the road conditions, how long I'd been hitching. Tony seemed easygoing, though he didn't talk much, unless I asked him something directly. The radio was turned low, playing some old rock station, and the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt was almost lulling me to sleep. Then, somewhere around the 20-minute mark, he said it. "You mind if we take a detour?" I blinked, sitting up a little straighter. Why?" "Shortcut," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "Trust me, saves about 15-20 minutes." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. He didn't sound like he was asking. "I mean, if it's really faster, sure," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, and a few minutes later, we turned off the main highway onto a narrower, less traveled road. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and the trees on either side seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower. I told myself it was fine. Drivers took detours all the time, but my stomach was knotting up. "So," I said after a long stretch of silence, "this road leads back to the highway, right?" Tony glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Eventually." "Eventually?" I laughed nervously. What's that supposed to mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and turned off the radio. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. "I have one condition for giving you this ride," he said, his voice calm but firm. My pulse kicked up. "What's that?" "You don't ask questions," he said, his hands tightening on the wheel, "and you don't try to get out." The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, the engine humming faintly in the thick, unnatural quiet. Tony's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might snap. "You should be scared," he said, his voice low and trembling. Before I could respond, movement caught my eye. In the clearing, the jagged shapes began to shift. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light. I saw them. Shadows, darker than the twilight, emerging from the spaces between the shapes. They didn't have defined forms, just shifting, amorphous outlines that seemed to ripple like smoke. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Tony didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. His entire focus was on the clearing, his body tense like he was ready to bolt. Knew he couldn't. The shadows moved with purpose, sliding over the ground like ink spreading through water. There were so many of them, too many to count, and they were heading straight for the car. "Tony, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to go now." "Stay in the car," he said sharply, his eyes never leaving the shadows. "Lock the doors." I fumbled for the lock button, my fingers trembling as I pressed it. The sound of the locks clicking into place echoed in the silence. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow, as I watched the shadows approach. They didn't make a sound. No rustling, no footsteps. Just an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. When they reached the car, I expected them to attack, to try to break in. But they didn't. Instead, they swirled around the vehicle, their amorphous forms pressing against the windows like they were looking inside. The air grew colder, and I could feel the pressure building, a weight settling over my chest, like I was being slowly crushed. Then they moved to the back of the car. "What are they doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tony's grip on the wheel tightened. "Taking what they came for." Before I could ask what he meant, there was a dull thud from the trunk, followed by the sound of metal creaking. I twisted in my seat, trying to see what was happening. Tony reached over and grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't look," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you do, don't look." I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The sounds from the trunk continued. More thuds, a strange scraping noise, and then silence. The air shifted, the oppressive weight lifting as quickly as it had come. I glanced at Tony, his face pale and drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. The shadows retreated, sliding back toward the clearing with the same deliberate purpose. They disappeared into the jagged shapes, melting into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the stillness of the night. Tony didn't waste a second. He threw the car into gear and hit the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away from the clearing. My hands were trembling, my chest tight as I stared out the window, half expecting the shadows to follow us. But they didn't. The road stretched out ahead, dark and empty, and the clearing vanished behind us. For the rest of the ride, Tony didn't say a word. I tried asking him what had just happened, what they had taken, but he ignored me, his eyes fixed on the road like he couldn't afford to look anywhere else. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't press him. I didn't want to know. Eventually, he pulled over near the edge of town. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I didn't argue. I grabbed my backpack, opened the door, and stepped out, my legs shaky beneath me. Before I could say anything, he drove off, his taillights disappearing into the night. I didn't hitchhike after that. I couldn't. The thought of getting into another stranger's car made my stomach churn. A few months later, I saved up enough to buy a beat-up old sedan. It wasn't much to look at, and the engine rattled like it was on its last legs. But it was mine. Even now I think about that night. The shadows, the sound of them tearing through the trunk. The way Tony had looked when he said, "You should be scared." I don't know what they took. I don't want to know. Whatever happened that night, the price of having my own car suddenly didn't seem so bad, not compared to whatever price Tony was paying.